DLC is going. It's all starting to click. It's all starting to click. A little bit. A little bit. It's... Sometimes when I'm doing blind playthroughs, I am really, really blind. Probably most of the comments you've seen are like, he's super blind. Like, what he's looking for is so obvious. Especially if you know. If you know, it's so obvious. And there, when I see it, I'm like, oh, okay. It totally makes sense. It totally makes sense. And I'm not going to lie, there was some prodding by the community because I kept... Whenever I did stuff where the chat was open, which is multiplayer, and I'm not lying here, even with thousands of people get it, and they're desperately not wanting to spoil things. So if we do some multiplayer, like we have to get like the Barioth armor, we're gonna have to kill the same boss like 6 times, right? Multiplayer is the way to do that. That's how the game should work. It's not a problem. And people get it, and they're like, we're not going to talk about anything that's coming up. And I wanted to do the Big Blue Dragon, right? That was my goal of the day, is the Big Blue Dragon. Which I now think, well, I know, was not the boss that the girl was playing blindfolded, because it was actually a rappel mission. But that fight was beautiful. I want to come back to that soon. Velkhana. That was our goal of the day, was to kill Velkhana. And the game didn't really want us to do that. And I've said multiple days, and here's the stupid thing. I've said on multiple days, I'm aware I'm doing things incorrectly, or inefficiently, I think would be the way to say it. Bosses are dying, we're making progress, but it's taking a long time. And I was definitely becoming more and more aware my damage just wasn't there. But I've also got the kind of highest tier weapon I can get. So something's wrong. Right? This is just logic. It's like, if I have the highest tier weapon I can get right now, it might not be the idyllic weapon, sure, right? But it's also like not a crap weapon. And we're running out of time on damage, then something's wrong somewhere. And I was hyper aware of that after our Barioth kill. And so I keep saying, it's like, I want to check this out. I want to check this out. There are certain things I didn't want to check out, like fishing. I'm not bothered about that. I think, based on the recipe list, that fishing leads to getting, like, better explosive barrels and stuff. Which, from what I could tell, explosive barrels generally are just like a bit of bonus damage if you can put them down or put them in a trap or something like that. That's fine. But not going to be like, oh, actually the boss has half HP if you use an explosive barrel. That's not likely to happen, right? There's something else going on. So I was more opinionated that the type of ammo, there are certain things happening that I did notice. Like when you're fighting a boss, occasionally they drop ammo, namely piercing pods. My understanding of why that happened is because you can use your ammo when you, like, jump on enemies. And I've also not really been doing that. I've been doing... I jump on enemies when I get the opportunity, and I do the attack because they're, like, semi-stunned, and then I carry on. It's just, like, a bit of free damage in my mind. But they kept dropping this ammo, and I'm like, there's a lot of things... And I know I kept saying this every video. There's a lot of things that happen in a tutorial. Like, you can ram them into walls. You can blast your entire ammunition pod into their face. And I'm like, I don't do any of that stuff. I should try doing that stuff. And so I came in with this mindset of like, I have to science stuff because it's now actually having an effect. And this is how it always works for me. Until it becomes a noticeable problem in the game, I tend to not mess around with a lot of like the sort of niche mechanics. Because we're doing fine without it. Whatever, just keep going and we're fine. But like actually running out of time and damage bothered me a lot. So I decided I've got to science some things. And our first fight was against I think it was a vicious Anjanath that we were fighting, like a bad dinosaur. And so I was like, okay, what are we going to do here? So I decided to try some things out. And I was like, right, I'm going to try and like ram something into a wall. I'm still not 100% on how this works. There's a button. I know how to do it kind of, but the order of operations is a bit weird, so I need to try this more. It's like sometimes you hit the shot when you claw onto the head, and you point the stick in a direction, and it will aim the enemy in a direction. So you should be pointing it at a wall. However, if it's already pointing at a wall, and I fire my stuff into it, it doesn't charge the wall. So I think you have to move it. You have to, like, tell the game, this is what I'm doing. I'm not just trying to do damage. I actually want it to run into a wall. So I think you have to somehow move it to make it work. And then sometimes I'll press it and my guy, maybe I've done the stick too early, will actually jump to a different portion of the monster and not be able to maneuver it. Still figuring it out. However, I did notice that hitting it into a wall is really good. Like, really, really good. It'll do something like 500 damage and on occasion stun them to the floor. So you can get wail in on them. Like, oh, this is just a huge DPS window if you can pull it off. One thing I cannot figure out, though, for the life of me, is sometimes I can attach to the enemy and sometimes I can't. I thought it was because that sometimes they're enraged. And I have an agitator set bonus, which only activates when they're enraged. I thought enrage was, I figured this out a few days ago. I thought enrage was when they were like sub 50% or sub 30% HP or sub 20% HP, whatever it might be. And then they're enraged because the last portion of fights has been horrible. Excuse me. And so I now realize with the agitator set bonus, it's like, oh, they enrage a lot. They enrage, like, periodically. They'll just cycle between not enraged and enraged. So I thought it was that, but it's not that. And so I figure it's like you have to wait for them to do a certain animation where they're going to be quote-unquote vulnerable because they're doing something else, and then you can attach. Other than that, they're going to be, like, already doing a different animation and charge through you, which is what I noticed. So I'm figuring that stuff out. One thing that bothered me, and I noticed, is I was chasing this dinosaur through the wastes. And I gripped onto its tail to follow. And I was like, right, doing some damage to it. And then I noticed, because the tail was so big, and this is one of the things that's been happening for the last 70 hours. And it's not that I hadn't noticed it, but I didn't think it's what it was. Is that the claw attack immediately breaks the armor of that piece of area. Because the tail just I hadn't touched the tail, and I clawed onto it and I attacked it. It just immediately got these white zebra stripes all over it. And I was like, oh, the claw breaks the armor. From what I can understand, this was a revelation to my chat. He was like, oh, thank God. Thank God. So I can only imagine, and I'm so sorry. I am so sorry to the TDP watchers that I have been blatantly just whacking away on armored areas of monsters relentlessly without them being broken, because it does wear off is what I noticed. Like, so I was paying now much more attention to these stripy white bits, and I was like, oh, and it wears off. It's like a temporary debuff. I was understanding, okay, so to put it in my context of what I was seeing, I did notice that areas of the monster were gradually getting, like, weaker and getting these, like, stripes and stuff on them. It's not like I hadn't seen those before, but there's also a lot of windows of, like, parts broken. Right? And this came all the way back to Stonebarry, where I just figured, like, oh, once you do X amount of... The way I understood the mechanics of work is that these start... The monsters start with their armor and full scales up, but as you do damage, they then break off, and you see messages like parts broken, and then those areas are weak. So what I was doing, or the way I understood it, is like, oh, sometimes I have grey damage, like I did against the Stone Barry, all the way back in, like, episode 2 of this. And then the more damage I do to that, eventually the leg will break its armor, and now I can work on the leg. And I was like, oh, that's how that works. That's not how that works at all. It became very apparent after I noticed this thing with the tail. It's like, oh, when you claw it and claw attack it, it's then weak, and you can do damage to it, which... Here's the thing. I did notice after I figured this out and became a little bit more... Like I said, things started to click. I started to get a little bit more scientific in my approach, a little bit more methodical, is that monsters were dying considerably quicker. And I was like... But I don't really notice a difference in the damage numbers, so I don't know if it's like a damage multiplier or something like that, because I usually see similar damage numbers. What I think actually the turn is, and I'm still piecing through this, so give me a little rope on this. I'm still putting this together. Is that it actually makes them more susceptible to periods of downtime where you get just overall a lot more damage in more rapidly, rather than it being like a 1.5x or 2x damage, because I'm not seeing that. I'm not like, I usually see numbers of like 100 plus or something like that. I'm not seeing like 200 to 300 plus on certain attacks, which would be a damage multiplier. I think it just weakens them a little bit, but I could be wrong on this. Maybe it's just different values of what's going on. But definitely you want to be trying to claw, breaking that spot, and then unleashing damage into that. So that makes sense. That's a typical game mechanic. Not strange. Weird, I didn't know... Here's the thing, right? It's not that I didn't notice. It's just that I misunderstood what the hell was happening. Because I just thought it was after a certain amount of damage, that area would then break, and now you've got access to a weakened portion of the fight. So that clicked. I also did ram a couple of things into wall. I was like, oh my god, that does a lot of damage and stuns them, and I want to do that more. Although I will admit, I totally forgot to do this like several times. And when I did try to do it, it didn't quite work. I was like, why am I on the wing now? This isn't right. I kind of want to rerun the tutorial to make sure I know how this happens, because I think you have to press like attack and then the direction, or maybe it has to be at the exact same time. I don't know. But I'll get it right, because it's just a button input order that needs to happen. It's just the order of operations. So that was great. I figured that stuff out. I nearly ran out of time doing this because I was like sciencing with this dinosaur, and I was like, I need to figure this out. The big thing that's bothering me now is it was told me at the start of the game, and I'm not sure if it's still in my hunting notes. I don't know what different ammo types do. Like there's against the enemies, I mean. Is it, and these are my theories right now, is it a case of like it's just the element type of the ammo is better against certain enemies? So if it's a fire enemy, picking up something like water moss is better. Water versus fire makes total sense. Fire versus ice. What bright moss does, I don't know. I don't seem to pick up like poison ammo or anything like that. Stones are the generic one. Red pods, I don't know. Whether these have a specific type of effect that you're going for, or work with certain types of elemental bonuses your armor might have. Something like that might be the case. Either way, let's go on to what we did today. So I kept getting, similar to the base game, is we knew we were going towards Velkhana. We had to study Velkhana tracks. But in order to do that, I had to overcome lieutenants. And it put more and more lieutenants in front of me. Like, and the worst one, I think... Oh, not even think. Like, the worst one that I had to deal with was one called Tigrex. Tigrex was so frustrating to me because I was actually feeling quite confident now. I was better. I was doing more efficient damage. This thing's hitbox is so wide and seemingly has no gaps in it. And I genuinely got frustrated because I couldn't figure out how to avoid this almost bulldozer wide hitbox that this thing has. It's extremely fast. Extremely fast. And you just can't get out of the way. I was trying like, okay, maybe if I dodge backwards to the right, dodge through it, dodge through the armpit, dodge like far left, far right. I tried like literally every direction, different timings. Every now and again, I would kind of get lucky if the hitbox was being in its scuff. But generally speaking, this thing was just ultra wide and just moving in a way that you couldn't dodge out of the way of it. And that became unbearable fighting this thing. Like, very frustrating. So I cannot. And it charges over and over again. And it's like, it's just so frustrating trying to figure out how to get around this thing. I did kill it, but not in like a convincing way where I would like to go against it again in an arena. And I now have optional quests, of course, like capture a Tigrex. And I'm like, I do not want to fight Tigrex again, like at all, in any way, shape, or form. But eventually it did unlock the access to Velkhana. Again, I didn't know, is this the last boss? I've killed a lot of bosses in the DLC already. And it doesn't appear to be giving me a new zone, because it's kind of giving me one new zone, and then the rest of the stuff takes place in the old base game zone. So I was like, this is the dragon again, like I saw the girl doing the blind thing. Wasn't that. That became apparent very quickly. But what I did fight was a surprisingly easy encounter, but beautiful. And the comparison I made while fighting this, because it even has this like gentle, wavy, dancey, like ballet style music what's going on. It's like, this 100% feels to me, I'm not sure what came first here, but it feels very inspired by the dancer from Dark Souls 3, which I assume came first. It's got that same vibe of ultra precise, flowing, natural movements that the dancer has, which is why the dancer is such a famous boss in the Dark Souls series. Is like, even though the dancer is not a difficult fight, depending, is that it's got a grace and a beauty to it. And Velkhana is similar in that it's got this like nice, swooping, very easy to read, surprisingly, mechanics to it. And the tail goes in a very precise, tiny hitbox, but if it gets you, it really hurts. But it's very precise and very predictable, but really kind of easy. I was surprised, actually. I was like, this fight is not hard in any way. And then I got an ultra scare of my life, because I was like, oh no, there's a phase 2. there's a phase 2 because I killed it and then a cutscene started playing. I was like, ah, that explains why this wasn't so hard, because this is phase 1 and there's a phase 2. And that's not quite what happens, actually. Velkhana, like, clearly powers up, like, evolves into a next Eevee transformation and is now Super Velkhana, which is like, that's probably the big fight that we're doing later on. That makes sense. And then leaves us to it. The frustration I found here, not just with, like, Tigrex's hitbox and things like that, was actually the handler. I can't believe... I know this will be contrary to how some people feel. I can't believe they made the handler more obnoxious than she already is. And by God, they did it. I'm starting to detest the handler so much. I miss Serious Handler a lot because they, for a very brief moment, they swapped her out with somebody else called Serious Handler. I was like, Serious Handler, that's my jam. I like Serious Handler. But then she came back rather quickly. It's not just that every time you go back to the mission hub, and you might have just different things to do, which the game gives you to do, right? And I will say I got a couple of hours over the weekend to do some optional stuff, because I'd not done any, really, during our mainstream playthrough. So I've done a few little, like, optional quests. I didn't get super long with it, but you know, over a couple of hours I managed to do some stuff. Not long enough for a stream, let me put it that way. Is every time you go out to the hub, if you do this, if you decide to do your optional stuff when she's got a lot of dialogue to say every time to remind you of what the main story is, it drives you insane. It's constant, it's relentless, and she just keeps saying these same things. I've got a full Ganath and Janath to fight, and I'm like, just shut up. But it's worse than that. In-game, there's a lot more happening in the DLC now where you're actually, like, out and about with her and she's, like, talking to you. Is she just jumps to the most absurd conclusions ever. And I get it. This isn't really a story-based game. The game is, like, go and kill big monsters. But they're trying to do, like, a story to follow along with, to explain why these giant monsters are showing up, right? They're trying to give some context to what's going on, so it's not just, which the game could maybe get away with, but it would be less fun, honestly. Is like, oh, and then another monster showed up, and then there's a bigger one, and a bigger one, and you killed that, and that would run dry very quickly. So they're trying to develop a story and a narrative as to what's going on, and these monsters are returning from the old world. I did ask my chat, I was like, are these like staples of the series? Because there's a lot of Monster Hunter games. This is my first one. Like, when they say Tigrex is here, are you like, oh, no, Tigrex or Velkhana? And they're like, yeah. Some of them are staples, some of them are new, but there is some that pop up all the time. I'm like, okay. And she just goes, she comes back and she's like, well, Velkhana is now so powerful, she could destroy... And I'm like, where are you getting this information from? Like, I was there. All we saw was was Velkhana get reborn like a phoenix and then fly away. I assume, yeah, she's more powerful now, but I'm not 100% on that. That might be her weakened phase, for all I know. That might have been her escape phase. But she jumps to these massive conclusions, and now it's grating on me, mainly because she constantly chats at you while you're in the actual game hub. But now I've picked up on that, and every time she speaks and she just jumps to these massive leaps, and I was making a joke, but I kind of feel the same way. She's like, you'll be on a mission with her, and she'll just be like, there's snow here. That must mean Velkhana's family is in danger, and she's probably looking after her children. And you're like, what are you talking about? Like, where is this coming from? What? I was there. Nothing happened like this. That you're just drawing these, and then the team's like, understood. We must move out immediately. I get it. It's just, but it's making me hate her so much, and I want Serious Handler back in so many ways. But our next goal, I don't know really where we're going. I don't know where we're going, because obviously we have to do Velkhana 2, Electric Boogaloo, but it gives me more lieutenants to do to work through it. And I think it's more of a showcase right now. Not that I mind at all, because the new versions of the old monsters are not just flat repeats. Like the Anjanath we fought at the beginning, where I did science on, had the big fire sword tail and had entirely new animations. Really frustrating, by the way. I spent a majority of that fight cutting the tail off, because I was like, I'm going to disable this dinosaur and he won't have his tail to stab me with. But they'd obviously, like, built this really cool moveset into it. So you cut the tail off, but you get a tiny piece, and it just uses the tail regardless anyway. I was like, oh, god damn it, man. It took me so long to cut that tail off. It was like the most hard part of the entire dinosaur. But they're good, cool versions. They're very, very fun versions of these fights that have had entirely new animations built into them, new things. So they've reused them in a good way. So I'm doing a lot of that right now, and that's fine because I just want to kill monsters. I'm enjoying the hell out of killing monsters and getting better with the combat. I'm not great yet by any means, but we are improving, and that's the important thing. But where are we going? I haven't got the inkling right now, other than like Velkhana plus, that we're going to fight that's leading us somewhere. Because I was curious earlier, like, what are we doing with Zora Madrigos? Like, it's a mountain-sized monster. None of that happening yet. More reasonable and respectable. So I'm curious as to where it's going, but I'll still be like, I don't really want this to end. But I will remind you, we've got the Plunderstorm tournament on Saturday, so I do need to get some practice in for that, because we're going to be throwing down. The Team Pacifism returns. There'll be details down below. But on Saturday night, we will be live for a Blizzard. It's like a 50k prize. It's huge. We'll see what we can do. All right? So thank you for listening. I'll see you again. Bye, guys.